many things I would love to come back to, but I think if we could maybe, is it possible to stay with the image
the
last print even that we ended with? And I thought, given the parameters of the title, the temporal body, that we could come back to this notion of time, because I take it's like it's like a topology that you're moving on, I think, where there aren't strict oppositions, fast, slow, time is articulated, time is flow. And so I wanted to hear more, particularly with the last piece, about how this idea that you were talking about at the end of time as very articulated as part of what it means for the relations that are so crucial to our experience of time being internal to the dancer's movements, rather than imposed by the music or imposed even by the relations with other bodies. So this idea of the time being articulated internally, how that interacts with the visual form of the steps, your own kind of cautious movement, which is, being organized in relationship to the potential to fall, the worry about the camera. If you could talk a little bit more about that, the articulation of time, then I wanted to come back to the flow question.
Okay. So for anybody who's been in the workshop over the last 4 days, we looked very much at the action of walking itself. So to begin on this very kind of anatomical note, I think that, so within the act of walking, there are many things that actually happen to the body, right? Like you want to put the right foot behind the left. So first to think about where does the walking begin. It can begin in many places. So you already have too many choices to think about where is the walking begin. Okay, you think it begins on the right foot, ball of the foot, heel of the foot. So already, but in the lifting up, for example, sorry to be technical, in the lifting up of a foot and in the dragging of that one foot behind, you already can subdivide the action perhaps into say 10 different ideas. That is, rather than just mechanically saying, I know how to do this movement because I've done it so many times before in my life, it's just walking down a staircase. But the idea for me of detailing it in excruciating moments is something that I started to look at because, and something which you wanted to touch upon, because dancers get very quickly mechanical in action. They know how to do this, they rehearsed it already. So how to de-mechanize, how to keep that movement so actually happening in that time was one of the reasons I started to force dancers not to just get into the aesthetics or the optics of movement, but to detail it and to keep working those details so that it's almost like the movement becomes a series of adjustments to the body. And even with walking, the detail could be in the pelvis, it could be in L4, it could be in some, suddenly you feel something in the sternum that wants to. So the walking itself is an organism for me that moves from the feet to the head back. That's the internal space of navigation. Then I have a large context around me. It would be very easy for me to disappear into myself, or anybody in that space, to sort of feel intimidated by the vastness of it. So there you need to find another set of anchors for yourself. You need to anchor yourself both to the vertical line, which the staircase is, also to the multiple horizontals. And at every movement down, you also need to understand where you are on that staircase. Are you 1/3 on the staircase, halfway, 3/4 down? Because every position for me on that staircase means, oh, now I need to activate this vertical, now I need to activate this horizontal. So those are the two sets of ideas, the internal breaking down of the the walking itself in the body, and then there's the space around you. And now I have also this camera on my foot. On my right foot, which means I know that that camera has two images that it's capturing. There's the moving away from the steps, because you have to move back from the steps to actually get the foot off. And then there's the movement down. And I know that on the movement down, there's all of these details of like the top of the stairs, where the moss is more interesting than other places. So I'm trying to, at the same time, keep my mind inside of the anatomical detail, because you don't want just some collapsed body to come down the stairs. So the body is trying to be in the external frame, within that internal anatomical detail, but giving a little bit of extra attention to what this camera is going to see, and how that image is going to communicate something about the quality, the nature, and the temporality, the density of that action, of sliding that foot away from the stone and moving further down. It's almost like, and then you realize, actually, as I watched back the footage, especially in the study film, that it's a cyclical action, walking. I mean, I think perhaps many of you knew that already. But I realized it more when I watched the way the camera was almost doing this. It wasn't just doing this. The stair wasn't just that flat thing and this fall down thing, but there was this cyclical idea that once I realized that, only because I looked at that image, then I could really play with that, right? So if you start to think of the walking itself in that way, like, it became very interesting for me. I learned a lot from watching this. Did I answer that?
Yes. I mean, it's fascinating, because what I wanted to sort of work through is this relationship between the articulation into parts and the notion of flow. And you've come into it in this way that I find really illuminating, because one thing I've noticed when you talk and write about your work is this language of a grammar, the language of the parts. We think of anatomy as cutting the body into parts so that it can be analyzed in its pieces, right? And the detail. So there's this idea of, taking each part in a very precise way. But then this notion of the flow is the reintroduction of the movement and the connection.
I'm sorry.
I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think that this we could link back to the small excerpt of Beautiful Thing 1, where I start to think about this idea of what is stillness and what is movement, of course, a very cliched idea in dance land. But for me, it connects with this idea of what is the beginning and end of an action. And what is the quality that we want to bring to this beginning and end? Is it a jerky beginning with an abrupt end that goes into the wall? Or is there another way to think about the beginning and end of action? And is the end of the action the beginning of the next action? Of course. So I think that for me, I use the word fragmentation, and I realize people must be saying, oh, but it just is fluid. But the fragmentation is what actually gives density to that moving body. It's what also keeps it awake everywhere, all the time moving, and not just being a perfect body in space. That's always been very boring for me. So I like this idea of internal negotiation. It's the dancer's secret. Nobody has to see it. But it's what gives the idea of the flow itself a texture, I think. So it's also not, I could also just break it down and show you the components, and I might, at some moment, I might do that as a choice. I have done that. But in a moment like with this, what I wanted to say is it's not flow. We tend to associate flow with something that's easy, fluid, something that moves without resistance. But for me, my flow is full of resistance. It's what gives just enough resistance. Too much resistance makes it jerky, right? We don't want to go there. That's a hardening of all of those exit points of movement. But for me, it's really interesting to see, like, what's just the right amount of resistance to give life to the action, you know, and it's that right amount of resistance which is exactly this. What is the beginning and end of the action? You know, what is a beginning and end that's so soft, that's so thin that one even doesn't realize there's a beginning and end, but there is.
Yes, and I wonder, I mean, this is helping me make sense of something you've said as well, and that you returned to here, which is this resistance to the image. And the image is sort of hegemonic in dance, dictating the movements that will produce the image as I understand it. And that's linked to, you know, in speaking about also Chandra's work, to the idea of capture. And, you know, this idea of inverting that so that the image comes from the movement instead. And I wonder, you know, when you think about particularly this last piece where the image is part of the production of the movement.
Let it play best, and it's on a loop.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, how did this piece, with the way that the camera is working to produce an image as you're also moving, how did that kind of come into your thinking about movement-image relation? And this notion of the dancer's secret that I find interesting, the like withdrawal and showing seems linked to this idea of the movement that, in a sense, can't be predicted in advance because it's always being negotiated someplace in a relation.
So, I mean, as you've all seen, those of you who've seen the image, the site is extraordinary. It has, but as I was saying the other day, it has a human dimension. It has a human dimension. And actually, when we looked at images, which had been sent to me, when I first looked at the site, it looked massive. It looked far beyond the possibility of making a solo work. And it was only when I went to the space and I walked and I stood that I started to understand, actually this space was built for maybe one or two, correct me if I'm wrong, Uma. It felt not a space that was made for lavish spectacles, like 10, 20 performers in the midst of it, but there was something in the scale that made me feel, oh, I need to be there alone as a single body. Now, but beyond this, it was very clear to me that it would be very foolish to think about choreographing a set of movement or to make like sequences of choreography and to transplant it back into the space. And I had 2.5 years between the first visit to Anuppur, this is where I made the study film, and the making of this film. And so all I did actually in preparation for the film was to understand, okay, so there was a certain geometry which I had to of course study and understand. So the geometry of the vertical and the horizontal. There's also the mandala, the square space in which the circle is implicitly held. And there were also, at a technical level, only few surfaces on which we could safely work and move. So my preparation for the film was actually only to train and practice without any thinking about what I would actually go to this space and do. And all I tried to do then, once I came to this site was to think about the body as a place through which one can actually see the site better. That is how I started to think about it. Not the site as the frame in which the body can look glorious, but somehow else. I don't know if I succeeded, but it was very clear from the beginning that this film wasn't going to be about me, and that this film was about something much larger than that. And so that's one of the ways where the problematic idea of, yes, the film is completely and absolutely full of images, but it was only this intent. You see the staircase differently when I walk down it, I think. And so that was one of the main ways. And also coming back to temporality, it takes a certain amount of time to even see a line in a space, to understand that there's that horizontal versus this diagonal or this line that's curving and taking the sky into it in the earlier parts of the film. So these were the ways in which I thought about, yes, there is an image because the site itself lends itself. I don't want to just be clever and do a diagonal shot and crop off this, crop off that. I was very much willing to go with the perfection of beauty which the site itself was. But the site is also a series of very moldy, very fungoid, very ancient, a combination of the ancient and the recent, because as you know, it's a reconstructed site. So at the one same time, you have very, very ancient bricks, and then all of a sudden some ugly concrete somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to hide that concrete either. The more recently laid parts are also a part of the film. So when you asked me, many people asked me, oh, what did you do in that archaeological site? Did you think you need, in Anurima's conversation, this question came up, or does it make sense, or did it make sense to you to do Bharatanatyam there, or some kind of ancient movement practice? Not at all. That would be very absurd, I think. I think the site is at once ancient, but in its graphic quality, immensely contemporary. Mm-hmm. And so the idea, I mean, of course one doesn't want to generate a massive clash of aesthetics in any place, but it was for me a question of also letting the site propose the action and just trusting that and going with it and having my own the side narrative, the secret where I could just also capture the site. So the site is speaking to me and I'm also speaking back to the site, right? Mm-hmm. So that becomes that conversation, the conversation between the images, but also the conversation between the body and the site.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple more questions on this, and then I have one final question, but I'm going to indulge my other questions on this. I have two. One is, we don't see it here, but I think you said you always dance barefoot, but dancing barefoot and being barefoot in this space was different. And I wondered how particularly the shots of the foot as a site of knowing and becoming, I think in conversation with Anurita, but becoming friendly with the site, right? Like you start to develop a relation with the site, which made me think of, even when you talk about doing Paper Doll, what it meant to work with a collective, right? And now this is a different kind of collective with the site. So I wanted to ask about those shots of the foot, knowing you can see it's your own negotiation of not a happy surface always. So I wanted to ask you about that, and then maybe one more question on the site, and then I'll go one more. I have many, but I'll be okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think in some moments I tried to, of course, dancers were very brave souls. We good at hiding pain in many ways. But there were many moments, not so much working with the stairs, that was a smooth surface. But all of the early parts of the film where I'm against the brick wall, It was a very, very grainy, pebbly surface and your instinct as somebody who would walk on that surface would be somehow to look down and to see where you're going. But this wasn't always also possible. So in a way, I think that it's another one of those parameters which started then to dictate the slowness, almost like the feet have to softly land, feel how many pebbles are where under the foot, and then slowly release weight in a way that, is possible. Not always comfortable, but once, it's almost like if you know where you're going to land, you can just prepare yourself a little bit more for what that's going to do to either your balance or the rest of the action, etc. And so in a feat, and I know there's a lot of shots of the feet moving in the film. That's partly because a lot of the time the camera was on my ankle. Mm-hmm. So a lot of, like the shot the film opens with is where I've got the camera on my left inner ankle, and then I'm filming my own foot as I cross over to the other side. So there are these kinds of ideas that are a combination of, Martin says actually by the end of the film it wasn't a foot anymore, it was a monster. Mm-hmm. So the foot and the coming back at the end of the film, I also I've shot this footage where I'm climbing up to the top of the site, and then I'm slowly turning to reveal the site, but my foot, the filmmaker, the second filmmaker is the foot in this film, mm-hmm. I would say. Both in terms of wearing of the camera, but also the way, it gives a certain kind of tentative quality, I think, to much of the action, mm-hmm. the ability to actually, and I've been working for a long time with the rotational ideas of the feet, legs, etc. And so that was actually useful. You see, the need to, it's much more difficult to just step or slide the foot, but to work through rotational ideas was actually one of the things that I could employ. Mm-hmm. So technical idea. Mm-hmm.
I have one question, and then I have two questions. I'm going to make one to end where we wanted to end. But just while you were describing, again, this piece in light of the talk, I couldn't help but start to think of the stairs as like another encounter with the spine. It's like a loop back to
absolutely
Chandra and your engagement with Chandra's work, and so in that traversing of the space where you sort of in a way begin your own movement. And so I wanted to go back to this question you started with around tradition, formation, the formation of your body at age 7 in this Bharatanatyam form.
Congratulations.
I had to listen to you say it multiple times. I had to stop looking at it on the page and hear you. And you are unlearning it, and then but it's in you always, right? And so this question, you talk a lot in your work, but here particularly you really see it. It's formed, it's in you, but you're also always moving into a space of risking. You talk about working in the space of the unsafe. And so here, where the space of the unsafe is almost literalized, that you may fall, but it's also the unsafe, and in some ways it's the spine, the site where you are articulating your own practice. I wanted to hear you talk about how this dramaturgy, I'm going to use your language of learning and unlearning that you've done in other works, worked in this piece.
It's a complicated question, but let's just talk about the spine itself, because that seems to be something that we, and somebody asked me recently as I began to teach actually an 8-class spine workshop for dancers who often surprisingly have no idea what the spine even looks like. Like, people never, I come from a family of doctors. Both my parents were doctors. So anatomy and that anatomical curiosity has always been there for me. So when I began, I was very asthmatic as a child. I had a very, very terrible kyphotic spine due to asthma, which even my dance teacher, nobody sought to correct that. So when I went to college, I let go of the Bharatanatyam practice, and I thought, well, swimming is the solution. So for 4 years, all I did was swimming. At least it cured my asthma, but the spine was still pretty terrible. I started to work with Chandra, who talks about the spine a lot. She says, she talks about the need to reclaim the spine. Our spines are broken through patriarchy, and all of this kind of discourse. But in my 10 years working with her, actually nothing helped my spine at all. I didn't reclaim it. It in fact got worse, because Chandra had this sort of, her aesthetic vision was for a very hyper-curved spine. Right? So anybody who works with the spine now knows it's also very injurious to just hyper-arch the lower back especially. And especially for someone like me who already had a very kyphotic upper spine, everything was wrong about that. But we, as I said, as dancers, we suffer, we never question the choreographer. And so for 10 years, I just went further and further into a kind of a spinal damage almost, and thought it was all natural. This is the dancer's life, took it, accepted everything. I stopped working with Chandra and I sat back for a moment. I traveled a lot in Europe, and I didn't even try to practice other techniques or forms, but I spent a lot of time just observing like other bodies in a space which didn't have hypercurvature. And I thought, well, I have a spine, they have a spine. I should be able to have the choice to do the hypercurvature or not. But once those things are set in the body, Bharatanatyam itself is a stylization. Once it's so set in the body, it's very difficult to unlearn that as a whole procedure. But at least I started to realize the need for this. That I don't just want to hold my spine like this because I did that for 10 years. I want to actually come back to my skeletal spine, what my spine was always intended to be, to keep me healthy and safe. So, together with my colleague, Krishna Devanandan, we just went 4 or 5 hours into the studio. There was no internet then, so we had just some books. We had a Pilates Bible, which I still use actually, which I love. And through these kinds of studies, because in those days, we didn't have access to Iyengar Yoga. Now I work a lot with Iyengar Yoga to understand the spine. But what was available to us in Chennai, even in terms of yoga, was not very useful or detailed. So we began with self-study, observation, and we started to just, our principal, the guinea pigs that came to us were all Bharatanatyam dancers with damaged spines. And this was fantastic for us because we had lots of people to kind of work on, rescue, save. So we started to make this whole pedagogy around how to bring the spine into this optimal kind of a neutral line, which incidentally, people then say, oh, that's a Western idea. And even people who've written dissertations on, there's a dissertation on Chandra called Butting Out, I won't name names here, where she actually glorifies and romanticizes this hypercurvature of the spine, and says it's a political and aesthetic choice. That might be so, but it's really damaging. So I let go of this kind of thing, the curvature, and slowly learned how to bring the spine back into neutral, and then how to rethink the spine itself as a place where we have options. If you want to curve round, let's learn how to do that. The spine only has 10 different ways in which it can actually articulate. Let's know all of those ways, but let's know how to come back to this linearity. And then let's learn from there how to work safely with the spine. So yes, my relationship to spine has gone through many different phases. So this has been also something I've done, not just with the spine, but there are many habits and mannerisms that especially like dancers trained in a stylized form have, and it's wonderful to have that. I mean, even our sense of time, being able to time with precision, comes from that. But it's like my husband, who's a jazz musician, says, if you take a musician who's trained, Maushmi, you can disagree, trained in Carnatic music, to always be on the beat with such precision, if you say, okay, now let's swing, let's go off the beat, it's almost impossible for them to do that. So in that way, I think all of these exceptional forms and trainings and knowledges are absolutely, for me, it's been a great gift. I never regret the fact that I did that for 10 years. Now, I feel sad that a lot of contemporary dance in India is dancers who have no background in a traditional form, that all go to the West, to Laban or somewhere, come back to India. And so they don't have any other references, resources. They come back, towards Bharatanatyam as an outsider. And so I'm always grateful that that's not been my case. That I have this foundational idea and I can move away from it and I can refer back to it. And that's a choice as well.
Thank you. I have so many more questions, but I know Nada has a question, and I know others have questions, so I think it would be good to open it up to conversation. Vanessa has a question.
It's around the mic, because it's being recorded.
Oh, sure.
Let's get another one.
Thank you. Wait, is this on? No. It is? Okay, good. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been really great. I actually just wanted to connect it with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier in the workshops. So I wanted to ask, is there any role that thinking through the moon at all has played in your dancing? Because actually quite a bit of what you said was resonating with my earlier workshop because we were talking about sort of the gate of the moon as it sort of helps the flow of liquid across the planet, and thinking through resistance in the form of gravity in different ways, but also sort of like the wayward kind of lunar tempo that's very different from the solar tempo that we're very attuned to through the calendar, but then also your reflections about spines and your back. We'd also talked about the fact that the moon, in its very intense gravitational relationship that it has with the Earth, which is very unique in our solar system, given that the moon's size in proportion to our planet, it actually takes the brunt of most of celestial debris that's coming the Earth's way through its back. And so actually it's like taking all of these, like its curvature is actually being erased in multiple ways. So I was wondering if there was something in like lunar tempo, lunar gate that might be resonant with your own work and thinking through this broader celestial system that we're in.
I can't say honestly, I can't say yes to this question, but it's a lovely image to think about. I mean, in my work with Chandralekha, I would say more so. And she has a work called Prana, for instance, breath or energy. It's not, prana is not actually breath. It's more the energy that breath can bring to the body. But in prana, she works with a Navagraha system, so which is the Indian system with which the planets are organized and celestial movement. And so, yes, there are these sort of references, these stories have always come and gone in different ways, but in my own work I haven't consciously thought in the way that you articulate, but thank you for saying, because it gives me something to take away.
Also, yeah, we were listening to jazz music around the moon. So you're bringing your husband and thinking about swing. I was like, oh yes, the lunar swing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, when you talk about, the return gaze of the performer, looking at the one who is looking, I always think that, yes, we can look back, but the question of agency, as we've been looked at, and then we've been constructed. How do we construct the audience by looking back during the performance? How are we constructing the audience who's looking at us? How is that happening?
I don't think so much about constructing an audience as a volume. I think of the audience as a group of individuals.
Yeah.
And there are very many different, every individual for me in the audience will be constructed differently by every single, in the same way that every single dancer in the performance has a different gaze towards and is receiving the gaze differently. So rather than seeing it as a problem of a larger kind of mass idea, that's where I would begin. The second thing is, I think that the dancer is gazing into an audience, but in a way that has an awareness that what that audience is seeing is anyway controlled by what the dancer is doing. And I think it's in that giving or not giving, or it's in that generosity or lack of generosity that actually the agency is. Or have a, for instance, in Paper Doll, oh, you want me to be a Bharatanatyam dancer? I'll do that. You want me to be this beautiful brown body? I can also do that. But there's always then that moment, so you're giving an audience in a way, up to a certain point, what it wants. That draws an audience. If the audience feels, oh, I know what this is. This is what I always expected. Sit back. There's always a moment in a performance where, especially in my work, I always will move towards the discomfort. And I love to, and I think that's why I've been in partnership with Martin for more than 20 years, is that we both have similar ideas of not making something that's sweet and cozy and easy to receive, but what is that work? What is the labor of an audience as well? And which is why I went into durational work, because I want this labor from an audience, but I don't want to make them suffer for it. Then the audience, I don't want them to be stuck in a chair and groan and moan. Leave when you can't take this anymore. Walk out. The same with the film. So I think that there's all of these things together go into what a performance is, which must remain a conversation and two ways. Well, I think we're done with those days of just serving something in a platter and this easy consumption that Chandra resisted.
No, I was asking because as a performer myself, using songs, singing for varied audiences in different spaces, I've had this. You come from a certain space, there are expectations, and then the way you carry yourself, what you wear, how
Just
you are,
sing jazz.
every bit, But I have a Bangladeshi friend in London, and she was wearing a sari and singing the blues, and so everybody was again very thrilled with that. So anything you do becomes exotic.
Exactly.
Always fall into the trap.
Exactly.
I have a question about the significance of repetition in your work. As you were speaking about how, if I was getting you correctly, a particular sense of movement lends texture to flow. As you were speaking about, I was thinking about the inevitability of the missed trace, the action of tracing movement through repetition. Each moment is never exactly like the past. To what extent is your sense of the significance of this missed trace within repetition figurative? And to what extent is the missed trace that's inevitable in repetition significant to your sense of the importance of repetition in practice?
Isaac, I always struggle to understand your questions, but I'll give it a good shot now. I understood. It's complicated because, as I said, and we were talking yesterday also about trace. So I'm just trying to really purely answer this for myself from my own performative experience and and also trying to think, why is repetition in my work in the first place? Having taught a whole course on repetition, here I am. But I think that for me, thinking through what the purpose of movement is, or why movement in the first place, right? As I said yesterday, is always where I'm really coming. There has to be a necessity to, why am I climbing down the stairs? Why am I crossing the stage from left to right? So I see the larger kind of compositional, structural ideas with which my choreography is made through this understanding of, oh, I want to go from here to there. So there's a movement through space itself, which is the reason I'm going to move in the first place, right? So I'm beginning here, I need to go somewhere else. Now there are two ways in which one can approach that problem. One is using repetition as an idea. Okay, I'm going to keep repeating the same phrase till I go to this point. Or a non-repetitive idea. Now, I think in my early works, there was a sense of the movement itself was so bizarre often for people. Like, especially in the early years when I started making work in India. So there was an unfamiliarity of the aesthetic itself, which made me feel, oh, I need to just do this a few more times so that people can actually start to read the movement. So, in a way, connecting to trace, but not being preoccupied with it. It was this thing of, and coming also to this legibility idea. It was a question of how many times can I do this until actually, it's like with a pop song, right? Every time the chorus comes, you can sing along because you gain that familiarity, the sense. And I wanted also people to be able to almost start to receive the dance not as, oh, they did hundreds of things and it was all very exciting, but what is that thing like with poetry that repeats? The line is repeated, and only by the 10th reading actually can make sense of everything about that line. And so in a way, maybe that's the analogy through which I'm working, is that it's not, I think it's different from being preoccupied with a trace, don't you think? It's an attempt through actually a very, as Brooke said, illegible work, but still an attempt And a lot of people say to me, oh, the work is self-indulgent, there's no generosity, but that's actually an error in the reading. Because, yes, I'm understanding that there's a difficulty in the access, but to almost compensate for that difficulty, for the bizarreness of what it actually is, I think I use the tool of repetition as a way to say, well, you have time. Didn't get it the first time, maybe you'll get it the third time. And it's the same for the dancer as well, it's no different from me. The ask I ask of the dancer gives also the dancer time to get into the details. And every time, as we did in the walking workshop, maybe this time you think of the axis, the next time you think of the surface, the next time you think of the center. So I just feel like there's too much delicious possibility of detail and transaction with movement to just not repeat somewhere. And so that's been, but having said this, the last solo work I made, Philosophical Enactment 1, with dear friend Avik Sen, actually, who's very sadly no more with us. And it was a work with just a single curved line of movement in space, with Avik acting as a commentator over it. And there the task, I said to myself, the parameters were very tight. I could either internally or externally rotate. So it was only a clockwise or anti-clockwise possibility of turning to get through that. Again, I have to go from A to B. But I said to myself, actually, I'm now going to make a fully non-repetitive work. So that work was only 25 minutes of a linear phrase that comes halfway and then is reversed back. So I guess that's a repetition of a sort, but it's a reversal, and nobody really understood that it was reversed. Did I answer?
Yes. I have a more of a spatial sense of the trace, temporal or lexical sense. Thinking about your practice, thinking about the way that's almost the viewer, if the movements are activating the space in the way that we hope, based on my understanding from the workshop, that it's actually the viewer that's tracing the hypothetical line of movement.
Yes, also. That's one part of the work as well, for sure. We were only dealing with walking, but when one gets into more other actions other than walking, then there are other things that begin to happen. And I've been also very, though I say I'm always going from point A to B, there are a lot of moments in my work which are looking at the axis and only rotational ideas. So where the trace that's the body of spirals. The trace is the spiral of the body itself up to this axis. So it's not the same kind of lateral idea, but it's another idea. How to travel with the movement.
Okay. You say the audience has to work, it's difficult, but this is delicious. This conversation could go on forever, but I think we had better stop. And people will have a moment after, will we do the launch very quickly, and then have time to ask Padmini questions as well at the break.